All right. So we are here this week, Wednesday, May 13th, with Adam Brock for the Favor Fireside. We're going to talk about some macroeconomics. I guess we always talk a bit about macroeconomics, but um, Adam Brock is the publisher of, or is the author of this book here that's got some excellent words of wisdom about structuring organizations and in consideration of many things, economics being one of them. There's a good chunk of the book that has different economics considerations in it, all from a permaculture principles perspective. So I'll let Adam talk about his work and what he's got for us today, and then we'll get into it. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Deacon. Thanks for inviting me on and giving me the chance to share my kind of analysis of economics from this perspective of natural systems. One of the things I love about talking about economics from a permaculture perspective is it really kind of invites us to challenge our assumptions about things we've grown up our whole lives thinking, oh, this is the way it has to be. This is how exchange has to work. And then once you back up and say, well, wait a minute, how do ecosystems exchange things? How have other cultures exchanged things? You realize that so many things we've taken for granted are exactly backwards and the wrong way around. And once you start to lay out these kind of frameworks and design tools, it opens up so many possibilities, many of which I know you are exploring in a really exciting way with the Favor. So I am going to get a little slideshow going, and we'll get some some slides going, but also along the way we'll have some time to have some interactive stuff and have folks share their thoughts. All right, so the first thing I wanted to do is really spend a while kind of defining or redefining, as the case may be, some common terms in economics or macroeconomics. And these aren't official, definitions. If you have a degree in economics, I'm sure you would be tearing your hair out. But they're definitions that I'd like to propose based on natural systems and how we might want to be rethinking about some of these things. So the first term that I'd like to throw out there is capital. So again, we probably in the news, in financial careers in that industry, we think of capital as kind of saved money or maybe the value of assets like real estate or expensive goods, that kind of thing. In this analysis, I'd like to call capital something that's captured and stored energy, and really broaden that definition of capital. Capture and store energy is one of the principles of permaculture. It's something that any well-functioning natural system does. So, of course, the prime example of that is in ecosystems, plants capture and store the energy of the sun, which is really the only source of energy that's constantly arriving on this planet. And they're able to take that and via photosynthesis turn that into all kinds of things and form the basis of everything else on life. And energy can be captured and stored in all kinds of different ways. So a couple of my permaculture colleagues, Ethan Rowland and Gregory Landua, have developed this analysis of 8 forms of capital that I use in my book and elsewhere that I think is really helpful. So, like I was talking about, that photosynthesis and all kinds of other captured and stored energy that life creates could be considered natural capital, right? So that is the stored energy or value of healthy topsoil, the stored energy or value of clean water, of fresh air, of biodiversity, all of those kinds of things that we can't live without, we could call natural capital. Then there's material capital. So that is the captured and stored energy present in all the stuff that we build. So you could call this infrastructure. These are our buildings, our transportation systems, our tools. All of those things are material capital that has inherent value. There's social capital. So that one's a little bit less hard to see or less easy to see, But social capital is the inherent value in our relationships, right? I think we all recognize that someone who maybe doesn't make a lot of money, but knows a ton of people and can always connect you to like really skilled or valuable or powerful people, that's a valuable person in and of themselves. Someone who knows a lot of people, they have a lot of value, a lot of capital. There's experiential capital. This is the kind of what you could call the knowledge that's in your bones, or muscle memory, right? So this is the stored energy that comes from having done something over and over again and being able to do it in your sleep practically. And that's of real value as well. There's cultural capital. This is the accumulated wisdom and knowledge and tradition that comes over generations and generations of people living in a place. So that could be something like specific, unique ways of dressing, or recipes that are specific to a certain country or region, folk songs, things like that. That's all cultural capital. Intellectual capital. So this is kind of book smarts, right? This is things that accumulate through either the scientific process or through people kind of building off of each other's philosophical ideas, those kinds of things. So this is the kind of accumulated energy you would find in a library or a university. There is spiritual capital. This is, I like to think of this as the accumulated wisdom of feeling connected to something greater than yourself. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a spiritual tradition, but any practice that you engage in on a regular basis that makes you, that connects you to kind of larger cycles of time and kind of greater systems around you could be considered spiritual capital. So all of these 7 forms of capital that I've listed are ones that kind of, again, have their inherent value. They're each valuable in and of themselves. And then there's this last form of capital, which is the one, ironically, that is the only one we think of usually when we think of capital, and that's financial capital. And the difference between this one and all the other 7 is this is the only one that actually doesn't have inherent value. Where it's valuable is being able to be a means of exchange between all of these other forms of capital. But you know, if you were on a desert island somewhere and had a big stack of, you know, $100 bills, it wouldn't actually do you much good, right? Unless you used it as kindling for a fire or something like that. So it's not like financial capital is valuable in and of itself. It's only valuable in as much as we can use it to accumulate and build all these other forms of capital. All right. So I want to introduce a tool here, and give y'all who are with us live right now a chance to think about this and comment. So the capital analysis tool is just a way of looking back at all those 8 forms of capital, right? Material, social, experiential, cultural, intellectual, spiritual, natural, and financial, and to say which forms of these energy are accumulating for me, whether you're looking at your own life, whether you're looking at an organization you're part of, whether you're looking at a geographic area. Which forms of capital are we currently wealthy in? Which energy do we have a lot of flowing through our system? And which forms of energy are scarce? Which ones are just kind of trickling in? And if we had more, we could really thrive. So I'd love to maybe hear a couple folks on the line if you have any reflections, again, whether this is in your own life or an organization you're part of, or in an even more broad way. What are some forms of capital, either that you feel like you have a lot of or not a lot of?
Could we please go back to the slide where the forms of capital are listed?
You bet.
And natural capital would be, I'm so sorry, it's like the connection to the natural world, or the ability to have natural resources. Is that right?
Yeah, you could think about it as natural resources, right? So it's, you know, if you have a big garden, that's a lot of natural capital. If you have access to the wild and go on hikes, that's natural capital.
Personally, my social capital is getting better and better every day. I work at a company that encourages people to ask each other annoying, nosy questions, which I love doing, and making a lot of cool friends that are very talented and lovely. So that's a big influence in my life right now.
Awesome. That's a great example. I love that. Anybody else want to share one of these? All right, then we will
Deacon, you're
move on.
muted.
Oh,
I am muted. Okay, sweet. Thank you. Yeah, I noticed that in the course of my work, there's a lot of interplay between obviously financial capital, but especially with social capital. When I start a project, it begins by drawing on social capital, and
mm,
then as success in that any given project is gained, sometimes I receive some financial capital from it. Not always, like with the favor, but social capital grows for most of the things I'm involved in. Social capital grows if I'm successful, and I also I see it diminish when projects are unsuccessful for me. But
mm,
whether they're successful or unsuccessful, I grow in experiential capital,
mm.
usually some intellectual capital as well.
Nice. Yeah, and I mean, I wish we could spend this whole hour just talking about these different forms of capital and how they interweave with each other and how, you can kind of play them off each other, right? But I have a lot of other fun stuff that I want to chat about. So we'll move on for now, but just know that this is a great tool and just a great framework for thinking about wealth in a much more multifaceted way. Okay. Um, so next term I want to unpack and maybe redefine is currency. So we usually think about currency, again, as kind of what we exchange between each other to buy and sell things, right? Like dollars, essentially. And I want to zoom out and really, especially thinking that there's all these different forms of capital besides just financial capital. All those forms of capital have currency as well. We can think of currency as something that measures and regulates the flow of that energy that we've stored, that capital, between different elements in a system, right? So that might sound a little bit abstract right now, but I'm going to give you a few examples. So in natural capital, in ecosystems, there are lots of different things that measure and regulate the flow of energy between how those ecosystems are doing. But one of the kind of classic and most obvious examples is water, right? Where there is water, especially here in Colorado, where we live in this kind of semi-arid ecosystem, where there is water, there is life, and where there is not water, it's really hard to get by if you are a plant or animal, right? So water could be considered a currency in an ecosystem. If we're talking about social capital, at least in our current COVID all online world, one way to measure social capital is through social media, right? Like how many likes we get on our post, how many times our tweet is reshared, how many followers we have on Instagram. That's a form of currency because those numbers actually regulate the flow of whose voice it rises to the top of that algorithm, right? So it's a very real currency of power and energy. And then a final example that I'll share now in terms of intellectual capital is a diploma, right? This is or normally would be graduation season here in May. Usually people would be receiving this little sheet of paper that, according to the rules we've decided in our society, means that you have achieved a certain amount of intellectual capital, and then that regulates the flow of which jobs you are able to access, right? So if I have a master's degree and that little sheet of paper that says I have it, then that means I could teach in a university. If I don't have that diploma, then I'm not conversant in that form of currency. Okay, next term I want to define is dollars. So again, we're used to thinking of dollars and currency as being pretty synonymous, but obviously all those other forms of currency I just shared have very little to do with dollars. So what are dollars? Dollars are a very specific kind of currency that's designed for very specific ends. So to be precise, dollars are a fiat currency based on debt and controlled by a central bank. So I'm going to restate each of those things so we're all on the same page. So first, a fiat currency. Fiat currency basically just means, kind of like when we were sharing that framework of 8 forms of capital, dollars are only valuable because we've all collectively decided they're valuable. Earlier in our country's history, and for a lot of history of advanced civilizations, currency was based on something real. It was usually based on gold or some other precious metal, which has a lot of inherent value because it can be used for all kinds of different things. These days, most dollars in existence don't even have a physical form. They're not like the things in our wallet, they're bits on our screen. But the amount of bits on our screen are valuable because we say they're valuable. So that's what fiat means. Second part is it's based on debt. And this is really important to the design of dollars because the way it works is the way dollars come into being, usually when we're not in a financial crisis like we're in the middle of right now, is they're loaned into existence. So essentially what happens is I have $100 and I put it in an account at the bank, like a checking account. And according, in my head, that $100 is there for me whenever I want to withdraw it, right? But according to the bank, they can actually take that $100 that they now are keeping track of and loan 90 of it out to other people with the expectation that that $90 will be coming back to them in most cases, hopefully, with interest, right? So that $90 will actually come back in a year or 2 years as $100. So now the bank actually has $110, that 10 that they set aside, plus the 90 that they loaned out, and the $10 interest, right? And so you multiply that by, a billion times a year, and there's actually more dollars every year than there were the previous year because of this fact of interest. And there actually need to be more dollars this year than there were last year in order for this whole system to work. The way a debt-based currency works is it only works if it's constantly increasing in supply. And then the third part of this is it's controlled by a central bank, which means that there's only one entity that can issue dollars that can say like, yes, this is a dollar and this is not. And that's the Federal Reserve Bank in the case of US dollars. Now, I want to be clear, all of these things that I said, fiat, debt, central bank, this isn't just US dollars that I'm talking about. I'm using that term because that's the currency that we all use here in America, but the same 3 conditions apply to euro and yen and pesos and any currency that you would use if you're traveling to another country. So what does this mean that we have these 3 things? It's valuable only because we say it's valuable. It always has to be growing, and there's only one kind of central entity that can control it. What it essentially means is because the supply of dollars is always growing every year, we are always looking for things, other forms of capital to exchange and turn into dollars so that we can have more dollars, right? So this is why things in our lives always seem to be getting commodified, right? You think about, growing up or like 50, 100 years ago, the way we used to have cultural capital, for example, was people sitting on their porch, picking on a banjo in some cases, or sitting around a fire telling stories. Now we have concerts that we have to pay $100 to see, or Netflix that we pay $10 a month to stream, right? So that's just one example. And so essentially what we're doing is pulling all of these pieces of capital out of this really solid, stable base that has supported us for our entire lifespan as a species, and finding ways to turn those different forms of capital into things we can buy and sell. And by turning them into things we can buy and sell, we're calling that economic growth, and we call that progress. But as this image kind of is hinting at, you can only do that so much before you're actually undermining the very basis of life, right? You can only cut so many trees down before you start to mess with biodiversity. You can only turn so much oil into fire before you mess with the global climate. You can only exploit so many people before they revolt. And so I think the moment that we're in, not just this moment of COVID and the kind of public health crisis and financial collapse, but really this whole, for the last 15, 20 years, has been a moment where this whole system of converting everything into dollars is really starting to get more and more fragile. Okay, a couple more terms. One is markets. I think this is a term that can very easily be misconstrued, and depending on your ideological orientation, people can have a lot of different really strong positive or really strong negative opinions about markets. And something I really like to clear up is what markets are and what they aren't, and the ways in which what some people call markets are actually something very different. So the way I define markets is an ecosystem of buyers and sellers, where the value of goods and services is set by supply and demand. So if you think about like a kind of traditional bazaar in the Muslim world, or certainly things worked very much this way in Europe, in Western Europe and Eastern Europe for many hundreds of years, is you have like all of these merchants, right, who have stalls, and the families and people and other businesses come by to the stalls and they haggle over the price, and that price might be different from day to day, from person to person, just depending on how many fish the fisherman caught and what season it is and how many other people there are making rugs, right? And so that the price is always fluctuating. It's this kind of homeostatic, in other words, self-regulating system. And everybody is kind of playing off each other. That is a classic market. And all the things that Adam Smith wrote about in The Wealth of Nations that people love to cite when they talk about the magic of the free market, that's really what he was talking about, was this kind of market. That's not the market that we usually have today. That's not the kind of market that people are talking about when they talk about markets in the financial industry. They're talking about what historian Manuel de Landa helpfully calls anti-markets. And the reason that they're anti-markets is because it's actually not a very healthy ecosystem. In anti-markets, you have a very small handful of sellers that are actually dictating the value of the goods and services they're selling, right? So if you think about airlines, there's only a few, really competitive airlines in our country, maybe 6 or 7. And they basically get to set prices because they're so huge that it's not like you can have a mom and pop airline that can undercut them. If you think about something like health insurance, if you think about a market, or a quote unquote market like internet service, right? These are all examples where supposedly it's a free market, right? There's companies that are competing with each other, but there's so few companies and they're so capital intensive that they have no incentive to lower prices as much as possible. And furthermore, they're so large and so powerful that they can actually influence government regulation in their favor, so that they can do things that are helpful to them and their bottom line, that actually don't create a better product, that don't create a better good or service, right? In contrast to markets and anti-markets, there's something called a commons. So a commons is another form of exchange, which is even older than a market, let alone an anti-market. A common is a resource ecosystem where accumulated capital is managed collectively. So what that means is, instead of buying and selling things where people set the price through haggling, it's a group of people that get together and say, okay, we all need this thing. Let's all figure out how to make sure it doesn't get depleted and that everybody gets the amount that they need. And that takes conversation, it takes rules, it takes people respecting the rules. There is a Nobel Prize winning economist, Elinor Ostrom, who, starting about 30 years ago, did some really, really valuable research on what are the preconditions for healthy commons, and analyzed commons throughout history, and what makes them tick, and helped illuminate the fact that just underneath our noses this whole time, we've been using these commons without really thinking about it, without really realizing it. And that brings us to this chart, which I think ties a lot of these ideas together. So if you look at the bottom axis, you have commons on one end where resources are managed collectively. We all decide who gets what and how much through democracy, deliberation. In the middle, there are markets where things are in this kind of homeostatic ecosystem. And on the far right are anti-markets where value is captured and deployed by these very few, very powerful institutions. On the bottom is exchange that happens on a very local level, and at the top is exchange that happens on a global level. And you can essentially, using this framework, look at almost any kind of exchange, any kind of economic activity and say, where does it fall on this spectrum? And usually it will fall along that dotted blue line. Things that are along the commons tend to happen a lot more locally. Markets are somewhere in the middle, and anti-markets tend to be pretty large. So on one end of the spectrum, we have publicly traded corporations. And the reason that those are at the total far end of the spectrum is because they are required, according to their shareholders, to maximize profit at all costs. So that means that they are legally obligated to cut whatever corners they can. Their whole job is to pull as many bricks as possible out of that Jenga tower in order to grow. And that inevitably leads them to a situation where they are getting larger and larger. They're always looking for new geographies to sell to. And so publicly traded corporations, yes, of course, there are some that operate only locally. There are some that might work in a more market rather than anti-market way, but usually they're tending in that direction. At the total other end of the spectrum, you could think of raising a family as an economic interaction. We usually don't because there's no dollars involved. It's not like if I had a child, I would charge that child for room and board, right? But it is a very local form of exchange. I am, raising a family and providing my children with food and education and things like that. And it's an act of love. And sometimes, in some families, there's an expectation of, well, you're going to take care of me when I'm older, or you're going to help with the family business. But for most cases, it's part of the commons. Then you could think of something in the social safety net, right? Like food stamps or social security, or in some countries, healthcare, right? And that's an example where it's mostly in the realm of the commons, but it's more on the national scale or maybe on the state level scale. Here in the U.S., because of neoliberalism, which is basically an economic philosophy that is saying everything on this chart needs to go as far to the right and as far up as possible. Here in the US, our social safety net programs are a little bit more market-oriented than they might be in other countries, but they're still very much in the level of the commons. Privately owned corporations are somewhere between markets and anti-markets, somewhere between, some are local, some are global, some are in the middle. A local business could be it certainly operates according to the market. Sometimes it actually tips into the commons, right? If you think about like mom and pop shops that really look after the people in their community and aren't just in it to make as much money as possible, they're more on the left side. And then of course there's still local businesses that are really totally market oriented. And then there's mutual aid networks, right? So like the Front Range Mutual Aid Network is in the commons. We're not buying or selling anything. We're helping each other out. We're exchanging goods and services and figuring out how to do that in a non-monetary way that's at a still local, but it's moving up to a regional level, right? So I think this framework can be a really useful tool that I want to pause and just ask everybody else on the call to think about where are some transactions in your world, some means of exchange, and where do they fall? How do you meet your needs using this framework? So anybody that has ideas about how they meet their needs and whether they're through commons, markets, anti-markets, feel free to share.
Something like Offer Up, where it's individual people in a neighborhood trading things, like typically heavily discounted.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm kind of confused where that would go, because we're trading for money, but no
Yep.
one's really making money. I mean,
Right.
they are, but on a very like a smaller scale.
So I would be inclined to put, that's a great question. I would be inclined to put that somewhere in here, right? So it's kind of market oriented. It's certainly not like a monopoly or anything like that. So it's more on this side. You're right. It's nobody's making $1 million off of it, so it's maybe a little bit more towards the commons, and it's hyper local, right? So
Mhm.
it's kind of in the middle, maybe a little bit on the left side and towards the bottom.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
it raises an interesting issue that's very big right now, which is that there are a lot of there's a lot of inclination to localize and to be very community oriented, and to be very interpersonal, and the platforms that we use to do that are increasingly owned by, like the plutocracy, by these
Yeah.
publicly traded corporations. And so your Uber driver is a person who lives near you, who is giving you a ride, who you could have met, on the street, but 80% of Uber is owned by the Japanese economy, and so your direct exchange with your neighbor, a large chunk of that profit leaves the country immediately, not just your neighborhood. Same thing with OfferUp, same thing, with Let Go, with all of the major exchange platforms, Etsy, all of those. It feels it scratches that itch for a farmer's market, but it's owned by a massive publicly traded corporation, the platform itself.
Yep.
I
Yeah.
can think of an example that might have helped a lot of us gain a little more that intellectual capital that I think would be in the top left of this graph, and that is Wikipedia.
Great example. Yeah. And you're right. That's exactly where it would be, because it's a global network and it's totally, outside of any kind of market. It's all volunteer run, and it's a classic example of a commons. So yeah, that's exactly where Wikipedia is on the top left. It's global and it's a commons. Any other examples or questions about this framework folks want to bring up before we move on?
Yeah, I'm just going to throw out a local anti-market, just because we got something in the extreme top left, something in the
Yeah.
extreme bottom right. We have licensing, right? Municipal, like, do you, in Denver, if you get caught selling a CD of the music you made on the street, you go to jail because you don't have a street vendor's license. You can get a street vendor's license and then you don't go to jail. But I've seen people get arrested selling their own music on the 16th Street Mall. That's an anti-market. It's like
Right.
as literally as literal as it can get. There is one organization that through violence maintains the right to control who buys and sells things, and to license that for revenue. And it's very local, and it's an anti-market.
Nice. Yeah, I was struggling trying to think of something in that quadrant, but you're right, that fits the bill. Cool. All right. Well, thanks for those great comments. I think that helps kind of illuminate all of the different ways we can look at the systems we interact with in our lives, and how they fall into this framework. And just very broadly, you can think ideologically about how people think the world ought to be, and put it into this framework too, right? Like I mentioned, neoliberalism is saying everything needs to be on the top right. Socialism is saying everything needs to be on the top left. You could say anarchism or anarcho-syndicalism is everything needs to be on the bottom left. I'm not sure what the ideology would be for the bottom right, but you can get the picture. It's like, by just plotting these very simple two axes, you can actually reveal a lot about kind of the story of where we're going and where we ought to be going. Okay, so I am going to move on from all these definitions to sharing some specific patterns and strategies. So now that we have these ideas and these frameworks, what do we do about it, right? What are the things that we can take action on in our day-to-day lives to start making some of this stuff shift. So the first is to make dollars flow uphill. So, the way I phrase this is referencing the fact that, again, dollars are a debt-based currency, which means that they are by design going to flow towards homogeneity, towards sameness. They're going to flow towards the people who already have them. So they're going to increase income inequality because the person who is owning the debt or who owes you money is going to get even more money in the long run. And so dollars flow towards those things the way water flows downhill. It's just a fact of the design of dollars. As long as we're using dollars as our primary currency, that's in general the way things are going to go. However, we can use some tips and tricks and loopholes to get dollars to flow in the other direction. And this background image is a very literal version of that with water. It's called a ram pump, which is a pump that just uses the kinetic energy of the flow of water, like in a stream or a river. And because of some of that energy, it creates a pressure that pushes some of that water uphill. And so essentially, what we're talking about is a financial ram pump. So what is something that sends dollars in the opposite direction that they're intended to go? Philanthropy, right? This is the entire nonprofit sector is basically a loophole that is trying to send some dollars in the opposite direction that they're designed to go. And the reason that the nonprofit sector is never going to be fully effective at creating the world we want is because it's still existing within that dollar economy. You still need a bunch of people making a bunch more money than they need in order to have money to choose to give out to charities, right? That's not to say it doesn't do any good, of course. It's still helpful, but we have to recognize the larger ecosystem in which it's a part. Other ways to make dollars flow uphill is social enterprise. So by that, I mean a business. So you're not relying on handouts or charity or grants. You're a business, but the purpose of your business is to make the world a better place. So you are making money, you're making a profit, but all of that profit goes back into making the world a better place. That's another way to make those dollars flow uphill. There is dynamic pricing. There's lots of different ways to set your price. Remember back to the that original free market of the people haggling, right? It's only very recently, I think in the last 150 years or so, that we think it's normal to have one price for everything, no matter who's buying it, no matter where in the world it is. For all of history, every culture before that, prices varied based on who's buying. Is this a stranger or is it my sister's best friend? Is it coming from thousands of miles away or is it coming from next door? And so we ought to reuse this tool of dynamic pricing to be able to take things that are desperately needed by people who can't currently afford them and make them affordable. And at the same time, maybe raise the price a little bit for the people who can probably afford to pay a little bit more. And then worker ownership. So taking businesses that exist within this market or anti-market economy, and by turning the power and decision-making and profits over to the people in that business, in that organization, one, you're empowering the workers, right? You're giving them access to that excess financial capital, that surplus. But you are also generally creating a healthier business, a business that is more community minded. And this isn't just anecdote. Studies have shown this. People have looked at worker-owned cooperatives, ESOPs, all these different forms of worker-owned enterprises, and shown that they're actually more profitable and that they invest more in their local communities. Okay, so that's all one strategy. The second strategy is reduce the need to earn, and specifically reduce the need to earn dollars that are this currency that is eroding our other forms of capital. So we can halt that erosion by opting out as much as possible from the dollar system. That's obviously not entirely possible, except in very rare cases. We can't just totally stop using dollars. Most of us have to pay rent. We need to buy food unless we're growing all of it ourselves. We have to use it sometimes, but there's a lot we can do to minimize it. By really participating in robust household economies, right? Growing a big backyard garden, repairing things at home instead of having to buy new ones, entertaining yourself by sitting around the porch singing songs and telling stories instead of having to pay money to go to a concert or watch Netflix. These are all ways that we can opt out of participating in that dollar economy and then therefore kind of hop off of that treadmill of having to make money in order to meet some of those basic needs. Cottage industry. So this refers to kind of very, very small scale business. So say, you know, I get really good in the household economy at growing tomatoes, and I grow so many tomatoes that I don't need to eat them all or keep them all in my house, but I have a surplus, I have extra. Well, then I can create on a very small scale, on a very local scale, either a commons or a market. I can sell them to my neighbors, or I can give them away. I can exchange them. So that's where it gets into these ecosystems of gift and barter. And then we get to this third strategy that I like to call heirloom currencies. And the reason I use this word heirloom is, again, to go back to vegetables. An heirloom plant is one that has been bred over many, many years, many generations to meet a specific need in a specific region, right? So there's certain varieties of tomato that are bred to be turned into tomato paste. And so they're made to be stored, and they're bred to take very low amounts of water and do well in a dry climate. That's an heirloom variety, right? And so that's very different than a monoculture, which is one kind of tomato that is used everywhere and anywhere, regardless of what you need it for or where it's grown. We currently live in a currency monoculture, right? Where we are using Federal Reserve notes, US dollars, for any and all of our needs, whether we are exchanging you know, goods on Craigslist, or we are paying the babysitter, or we are buying something off Amazon. It's all the same currency. It's a monoculture, despite the fact that we have all these different needs when it comes to currency, and we're exchanging on all these different levels. So an heirloom currency is a specific kind of currency that's designed for a specific need in a specific place. It's designed by intention not to be one size fits all. It's this one thing is really good at meeting this specific need. So time banks are a great example of that. So that's where instead of exchanging value in terms of dollars, you exchange in hours. So if I spend 6 hours pulling weeds and transplanting in my neighbor's yard, I accumulate 6 hours in that time bank. And then someone else who doesn't have anything to do with that neighbor could do 6 hours of goods and services for me, and that would cancel that out. So time banks are a really great way to exchange without needing to use dollars. There's something called local dollars, which is a kind of catch-all term for things that are basically kind of pegged to the dollar, but they can only be used in a specific geography or among specific businesses. The background here is Ithaca dollars. So this is a currency that can only be used in Ithaca. And you can exchange them for dollars, but they're meant to be to encourage business to recirculate in a local economy. There are giving circles. So this can be done with state bank issued currencies like dollars, but it's a way to keep that money circulating locally, where you get a group of people together every month, say everybody throws down 20 bucks or 100 bucks. And one month you have a conversation and decide that all of that money should go towards one person who's starting a new dog grooming business. And they take all of that money and use that to buy equipment and to get their business up and running and to attract customers. And then they start making money, and then they bring that money back to the giving circle the next month with that same finite group of people. And there's an even bigger pool that then can be lent to someone else. And so it's growing and growing, but staying within that same bounded community. And then there's credit clearing exchanges. And so this is a form of heirloom currency where, again, there's only a select group of people who are involved. It could be individuals or it could be businesses, but either way, they're doing goods and services, exchanging things but they're doing it in a way where even though they're using dollars as the currency, no dollars have to be exchanged because it's all canceling itself out. So as long as the transactions stay within that ecosystem of people that have bought into it, you can have, hundreds of thousands, millions, in some cases billions of dollars of buying and selling without actually ever having to touch the currency or even have it in your bank account. Because say I owe you $100, you owe a third person $100, and that third person owes me $100. Well, in that case, nobody owes each other anything because it cancels itself out. This last one, the credit clearing exchange, is what the favor is, the local currency that Deacon and others of us are starting to experiment with. That's essentially what that is. Okay, so those are kind of three big strategies for how to interact with economies in a more permaculture way, to make dollars flow uphill, reduce the need to earn, and to employ heirloom currencies. So now I'm going to stop the slideshow, and I would love to wind down with just a few minutes of questions or comments.
Yeah, I wanted to throw in a couple things, some notes that I jotted down. When we were talking about anti-market behaviors, the big classic one is price fixing, and that's one of the ones that we feel most acutely when we look at how arbitrary pricing is. Like airlines, if you look up your ticket price on Tuesday morning, it's radically different than on Friday night and all that kind of stuff. And it's just like, it's the same flight. Why? So price fixing is a major anti-market behavior. A few other ones that I think are very important to think about are the quality diminishment. So as a firm, any firm tries to get bigger, it has to become more of a catch-all. It has to appeal to everybody. And this has bled over and influenced a lot of small businesses. Small businesses are starting to think like, oh, we have to have mass appeal so we can compete with Kroger. And it's like, no, you can't compete with Kroger, and definitely not by trying to have mass appeal. And reduction in quality and reduction in niche. So reduction in specialization is a thing that comes with moving to that top right. No longer can you have a thing that's for you. I've got this mug that was made by Sean Reifman, and it is like uniquely suited to me. Like you're not going to find this mug like in Target. Like I like that it doesn't have a handle. I like that it's rough on the bottom and that it has these finger grooves. Like it fits directly onto I can't lift up my mug warmer, it's plugged in, but it fits like right in my mug warmer. Anyway, it's specialized. It comes from a potter I know. And we lose all of that when we move to the top right of that global and market spectrum. The other really big anti-market behavior that we need to look at very closely is the creation of externalities. As anything moves to the top right, in order to maximize profit, it doesn't just cut costs and become generic. It also offloads any costs it can, especially in those other 7 forms of capital, but also even in the financial capital. So like Walmart will offload the externality of actually paying its employees by holding seminars on how its employees can apply for low income assistance and things like that, and cut their hours so that they qualify, so that it can afford to have lower paid employees. So they even offload their obligation to financial capital. But then also they're going to, as you move to the top right and you can influence politics, you're going to pollute more. You're going to draw from cultural capital more without reimbursing. All of your costs get offloaded onto the general public. So the creation of externalities is probably the biggest anti-market behavior that really cuts away from our future and diminishes us that way. I also, when we were talking about the worker-owned businesses, a lot of times I think people think about worker-owned businesses as like your little neighborhood, like, there's 3 bike mechanics in a garage, and that's a worker-owned business, which it is, and that's awesome, and you should go support them. But sometimes we forget that like Tillamook, the dairy company that make great ice cream, that's a worker-owned business. It's like across the board worker-owned. Also, I think more than one of the big breweries in Fort Collins is worker-owned. Fat Tire, I know. I think a couple other ones. There's a few breweries that are all worker-owned. And Ocean Spray is worker-owned. So it's like it doesn't worker ownership, and Mondragon is huge. Mondragon is 80,000 employees. Guahan, I believe, also is like one of the largest. I think it is the largest technology company in the world. It's worker owned, which is nuts. And 40% of their employees are in research and development partially. So they have a split job. So it's this massive company, you know, a couple 100,000 employees, and all of them own it. And 40% of them are in research, in addition to their normal tasks. And you think about how fulfilling that is. It's, you know, I'm not actually advocating for massive scale in businesses, but it's a really important thing to think about, that there's no cap on worker ownership. And then I just wanted to emphasize that recirculation is, in terms of reducing the need to earn, $1 in $6 in the entire economy is spent on customer acquisition. So that's every, you know, business. If you're not the principal business owner in a business, you don't necessarily think about this. But for any given business, one of their largest expenses, if not their total largest expense, is in getting new customers. You know, so that's all of marketing, all of advertising, all of these different things. That's customer acquisition. And when you're a part of a recirculation system, so this includes the favor, this includes time banks, this includes all, you know, all these different systems, you exist in a pool where there's a catchment around it, because you don't have to reacquire those new customers. You get to know each other. You build trust, and the trust that's built, it takes care of that enormous expense of advertising and marketing, because you've committed to a pool. And that pool says we're going to do business with each other. And that, when you think about $1 in $6 in the economy, that's enormous. So I just wanted to throw those things in there.
Yeah, no, great additions. Thank you, Deacon. Appreciate that. Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
Something came up for me a while ago, and I'm wondering how it fits in.
Mm-hmm.
So
get a little closer to the mic so we can.
Yeah. This.
Whoa, you got like a mic. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's not mine. I'm borrowing it for some production stuff, and it's I'm still figuring it out. So if this sounds good, cool. I got the thumbs. So like there's this practice in the macroeconomic sphere with a lot of tech companies that is called dynamic pricing, and that's relatively new. It's this thing that has only come about because we've had the technological allowances to make it happen. And so it tracks user data, and user data is like this incredibly valuable commodity right now. And it's traded for huge sums of money every year. And basically companies can see what users are likely to do based on their data. So they can see what things they click, what things they are likely to buy, their habits, whether it's like in shopping or traveling or investment of any kind. And that agitated a lot of people. Like when they realized what was happening and that companies were doing this kind of brings up a big ethical problem, because a company can sell you or can advertise to you shoes in your little sidebar that all cost different amounts based on what screen you're viewing it on. And that's like, and it's clandestine. No one knows that that's what they're looking at. They think that they're looking at the price, but the concept of the price has kind of gone out the window with this. What's interesting to me is that it actually is like the macro scale of what a lot of people do on the small, like commons scale, which is like pay what you can. And so that's like there's actually an ethical impetus to do that, because they're like, I want to make what I'm doing accessible, so I set it based on what people pay. Yeah. And it's funny because on the small scale, it seems like an ethical thing to do, and it's like the right thing to do. It's egalitarian. And then on the large scale, you're like, whoa, pump the brakes. Like you can't tell me what I get to pay based on how much money I earn. That's not fair. I want
to jump in on this. This is super great, and I know that at least you, I guess, have to go pretty soon.
I got to push back for a sec.
Oh, you got to push back? Okay, sweet. I really firmly believe that the one thing in doing anything like that makes it unethical is the opacity. it is like you said, it's clandestine. It's that you're not upfront about it. I tell clients all the time, I price based on like the weight of your need. So like I'm basically telling them, if you have more money, I'm going to charge you more money. So I get one client that comes to me and they say, I need a logo. And I talk to them a little bit about their business. And I say, look, I think I should charge you like $6,000 for this logo. Talk to somebody else. I'm like, I'll do this for a sandwich. Right. And the thing is, they're actually getting something different, because if I'm charging somebody $6,000 for a logo, I'm going to do like I'm going to go through this whole process of looking at they're going to put that logo on a lot of things, and they're trying to have a far reaching thing. The person I'm charging for a sandwich is the person who has like a sandwich kiosk, downtown. They're going to put their logo in one spot. It's like above the sandwiches. That's it. They don't have to worry about it being too similar to some other person's logo. They don't have to, all these different things. It just has to reflect their basic personality, what their sandwiches are like. That's it. Like I can probably come up with it off the cuff. Half an hour later, we're done. And I've done this recently. I did this for a yoga instructor on the phone call. He got off of my Calendly thing, just grabbed an hour with me. I did his whole branding while we talked about yoga philosophy on the call, sent him the AI files, his everything, because he's a yoga instructor, right? He doesn't need a research project to get brand identity for his business. And when you look at valuing the customer instead of the product that way, people really feel seen, right? That's not an ethical problem. My big clients are like, yeah, you're calling in consultants, you're testing this in front of my audience members, you're going to do all this stuff, and you're going to charge me like an appropriate amount of money because I'm a big and then the sandwich guy's just like, same thing. He feels really seen. It's like, you want one of my sandwiches? So like you think that you do these big logo projects and you think one of my sandwiches is that good that you would accept it for a logo? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And it's real, right? And when we think about dynamic pricing, it can go that big. I actually, in terms of the specific practice I use for valuing those kinds of jobs, it comes from, I look at Chris Doe's method, which actually I think is mostly Blair Enns' method, but Chris Doe puts out a lot of content about it. And he goes through this exact same process for valuing six-figure jobs, and people respect it and feel seen even at that level. So it works all the way up and down. It's just about being transparent, and transparency and honesty is at the core of ethical business and ethical economic initiatives all across the board.
One more thing I would add to that, Deacon, that I kind of heard implied in what you said, and was actually how I was going to respond to your question, Cal, is it's also about relationship. When things are not strictly transactional, but there's some amount of like, who are you as a person, and what are your actual needs that you're coming to me with this for? That creates a connection that goes beyond exchange of currency and gets into meaning and creating. It's almost a commons, because Deacon realizes by providing this service to the yoga instructor or a logo for the sandwich person, that it's going to make our local economy better in some small way. And so he's willing to go out of his way to do that, because he's being transparent, but he's also creating relationship.
And I got a great yoga class out of it.
Nice.
So, yeah.
All right, maybe any final thoughts, questions before we leave?
Elizabeth, you've always got something. You got to pick a fight before you leave. Otherwise, I won't feel like you were here.
Oh my gosh, is that how I'm being characterized now? Great. No, I don't have anything. I'm actually really excited to look up this Chris Joe thing and some of the dynamic pricing stuff, because I am like in the process of developing a pricing model for mediation.
Yeah.
And it's been like a very long, like intellectually like exhausting process to just constantly try to see like what my competition is doing and like how to think about charging for time. I would say that like I don't know if it was listed in your capital. I think it was new cultural capital. Like I can say that there is some racial capital that I've definitely banked in on, which is not a story you often hear. You also hear how white privilege is a currency, but I would say that as a person, especially a woman of color, I think I also am starting to get some currency in certain circles. Like, it matters that I'm a woman of color to be running the Professionals of Color Network. It matters in a lot of mediations that they have a mediator of color, and I'm able to bring that to the table. And that being said, like, yes, also being a woman of color comes with a lot of like negative credits that are inherited. But I would say that's something that I've been happily cashing in on. And it's not totally extractive either, because I think people need that. They need to see themselves in certain things, and they need to feel like they have a fair process. They need to have somebody who's embodying some sort of fairness for them. So that would be a currency that I think was at the beginning of the presentation we talked about, that I think can go both ways.
Yeah, I love you bringing that in, and it kind of, I mean, we could go way beyond race to all kinds of other intersectional forms of identity and talk about how those forms of identity intersect with those forms of capital and get really into that. But I think that stuff
It
is
gets really juicy. I mean, like, I'm mixed race too, right? Like, so I also get some white privilege from having a white parent. So it is like a very, that's more of like that's very socially constructed and culturally constructed. And like, if the context is different, it wouldn't be a currency in the same way. So it really is dependent on like how race is defined, and like how like the group I'm in relates to race, right? Like, in some places in the mediation community, I like cannot say anything because I'm young and of color and a woman, and if I say it, it won't be heard in the same way as if an older white male says it. So it is like very dependent on the situation and the culture and the who's there, and like the degree of nuance also depends on those things. Like, I'm a woman of color, I'm also like a mixed race person who's half white, right? Like, there are lots of things that like change, and it's dynamic based on where I am. But I would say that it's something that, like, I don't know if I'd want to call it like a currency, but it is like some mode of like, there is some value in it, and there is some kind of exchange based on who is like perceiving what they see.
Yeah, no, I think that's very real. And it's an important lens to view this stuff through as well.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
I think a lot of when we look at some of the interactions there, it comes down to like essentially that kind of an incentive systems, which is like the microeconomics lens, you know, of like does one person's position create for them an incentive to view a thing a certain way versus another way, and then, you know, you get those like those gaming tables of like, in this environment with these perceivers who have these, you know, boxes to check, like it plays out this way. And in this environment with, you know, you're throwing different cogs and pieces. And so you get this thing where like incentives are neither squarely a matter of capital or matter of currency. They're another component, but they're like, there's overlap there. And bridging that macroeconomic gap is it's a fun domain. I like playing there when I can. Thank you so much, Adam. Oh, somebody else say something?
Oh, I just said I'm playing on that edge, right?
Yeah, playing on that edge. Yeah. Does anybody have anything else to add? That was a lot of information. I'm wondering if everybody's, because the cup is full and everybody's kind of just like in that space.
So we kind of have a concept of money that is fundamentally flawed, mainly because it seems to be backed by debt, right? Versus the alternative types of, I'm forgetting the word, like money, or what is it?
Heirloom currencies.
Heirloom currencies, which seem to be like much more about social connection, which is super unfair to jerks. And by what I mean there is like, some people are extremely socially awkward, and having social currency is an advantage a lot of people can't control. And so I'm wondering about that. It's just something that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, so the beautiful thing about heirloom currencies is that they're the opposite of one size fits all. In other words, you can create an heirloom currency that specifically meets the needs of socially awkward people.
Bitcoin.
Excellent
Yeah,
point.
Yeah.
right.
Bitcoin's great for jerks. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it all depends on the assumptions and yes, the biases of the people creating that currency. And in my mind, this is ideally an iterative process. So like you create a currency, you test it out, you see who uses it, who is being disadvantaged because of it, and then you revise the currency and make it so that it continues to get better and better at meeting the broader social outcomes that you're aiming for. So like, if I design a currency and then a bunch of people start using it, and then I realize, oh shit, like there's a bunch of people in the society that this is not working for, it's on me to adjust that currency and make it even better, or come up with a new currency that meets the needs of that niche.
Yeah, so diversity of currency would in some ways be like maybe the best
Yes.
solution here, because then you have like multiple competing experiments
Yes.
and multiple niches. Gotcha. Thank you.
Right. We don't want to replace one currency monoculture with another currency monoculture. We want to create a polyculture where we're using lots of currencies to meet different needs.
Yeah. One of the big things for me when I was first getting into this, and into looking at currency and economics, like I was younger, I was angrier, and I was very like, honestly, like angry at like interest-bearing debt-based monetary issuance. And it actually, one of the things that prompted me to reconsider that, and this might sound really weird, is you guys know Marie Forleo?
Yeah.
Marie Forleo is just, she's a woman from Jersey. She's very fiery. She cusses a lot. And actually she cusses like, I think, a reasonable amount. I don't know, whatever. But she's like a really close friend of Oprah's, for anybody who doesn't know her. Like that kind of describes like what kind of scene she's in. And she said that Shark Tank was one of her favorite TV shows. And she's actually a woman who, another quote from her is, "Growth for the sake of growth is a disease," like the mentality of growth for the sake of growth. So she's like very much in line with a lot of the economic and business thinking that that I've been really into, and is actually kind of like a mainstream person pushing this edge of like developing niches and returning to markets and destroying anti-markets. And she was talking about loving Shark Tank, and I listened to her describe what she loves about Shark Tank and why it's so cool for her. And I decided to really dig into thinking about it. And this thing I realized is that basically because of our economic, the system that we have, where because of the monoculture, we have this system that far disproportionately rewards VCs, venture capitalists, anyone who gives access to capital as a service, which is basically what the job of venture capitalists. They give you access to their money. You can use their money, and that's the service they provide to the economy. And that is absolutely the highest paid kind of service that an individual person can perform in the economy. It is way disproportionately rewarded, and it's disproportionately rewarded because we're in a monoculture. If we actually eliminated the monoculture aspect of how our economy works, that doesn't mean that job goes away. It just means that it's not this wildly disproportionately rewarded thing. If we have currencies that are designed like the Virgil was a current, the Virgil, it's Austrian. I can't pronounce Austrian and German things, but I think it's the Virgil. That was a currency that was really designed towards increasing material and natural capital. Everything about the way the Virgil was designed bolstered natural and material capital. People were making really long-term physical investments because of the dynamics of that currency, which I won't get into. And so if we have currencies that that return energy out to those other 7 forms of capital, then all of a sudden being a VC is just another job. It could still be a very highly paid job, but it wouldn't be more highly paid than being a doctor or a dentist, or anything like that, which right now it's bonkers how much we think about surgeons make a lot of money, nowhere near what a VC makes. And that doesn't make any sense for like the level of education and service to society, but it's just because of the monoculture of how our currency system is designed. Yeah, that was it.
Yep. So true. Yeah, I mean, it's like dollars have a use. Like it's very helpful to be able to have a currency that I can spend and get something from halfway across the world that I could never acquire from here. But you know, if we're using that same currency to meet a bunch of local needs, and therefore that currency is much of the value is being captured by corporations across the planet, that's when things start to get not great.
Absolutely.
All right, y'all.
I want to take this moment for those who are not in this room to say, if you got this far in this video, like, subscribe. If you listened to the last hour and 17 minutes of us yammering, you should subscribe. You should hit a like on this video. You should leave a comment. I will respond to any comments. I'll answer more questions. I'll like dialogue with you guys. I actually looked at like my YouTube channel today, and I haven't gotten a single like in the last month. I've got 8 hours of viewing. I only have a few videos, right? I've only made a few of these. The 8 hours of total viewing, not a single like. I was just like, and I realized this because I'm not even like letting people know, like there's a like button down there. Like, I don't know, you know, social currency, right? Like let's respect it. If you got this far, show some love, share the video with somebody. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Deacon, for running this show and for playing host to such important and stimulating conversations. And let's keep it going and look forward to seeing y'all at another fireside chat next week.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Bye, y'all.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. Deacon.
Yes.
You're so fluffy. Fluffy, fluffy,
So
fluffy,
fluffy.
fluffy, fluffy, fluffy.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop.